unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives,
a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Before we get to today's show, I'm excited to announce that we'll be putting on a special live edition of Grant Tamasha on Tuesday, May 19th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be joined by Grant Tamasha regulars Thampi Madan of the Brookings Institution and Sadanand Dume of AEI and the Wall Street Journal for a special live version of our monthly news roundup via YouTube. Details and links for tuning in and asking questions are provided in this episode's description. This is an experiment for us, but I think it should be a lot of fun, and I hope you will join us on YouTube on May 19th. As for today's show, we're recording this episode on Thursday, April 30th. We are on day 36 of the unprecedented nationwide lockdown in India. The government has signaled that it hopes to engineer a calibrated relaxation of this lockdown starting on May 3rd. To discuss the economic impacts of the crisis and what steps government can take to cushion the blow, I'm pleased to welcome Arvind Subramanian back to this podcast. Arvind, as I'm sure most of our listeners will know, served as the chief economic advisor to the government of India between 2014 and 2018. He's now a professor at the Kennedy School of Government and a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. He has been nothing if not prolific in his commentary on the current crisis. It's a pleasure to have him back on the show. Arvind, good to chat with you.
Great to be on the show, Milan. If you recall, we did the first show together, so it's great to be back.
We did the first show together, and I'm now, I think, on episode 53 and counting. Arvind, I want to go back to something you said when this crisis first began to take shape, and it's actually occurred in a tweet that was quite prescient, and I just want to read out the first tweet in a thread that you began. You wrote the following: "Wanted, Committee to Save the World. Coronavirus pandemic requires a global response, especially as threat spreads to poorer countries, but the Kissinger question haunts. Whom should we call?" That was the end of the tweet. So I'd like, if you could, to maybe evaluate for us the international response to date, particularly on the economic side. And then, maybe you could answer this question you yourself raised, which is, whom should we call?
Right. I think, first of all, I think it's fair to say, Milan, that if we were to give a grade to the international response, remember there's a kind of health component to it and the economic component. And, I'm not an expert on the health component, but I think many people would say the response has been highly deficient as well. But on the economic side, I would give it a, D minus or a D plus or a C minus. Because think about it, relative to what many people think should be the scale of just the financing that developing countries might need to combat the crisis. Basically, what's been announced is a short-term moratorium by a few creditors that would help a few countries. So it's been completely inadequate, because I think I have seen estimates that the financing requirement could be something like $2.5 trillion. But very little has been forthcoming. And of course, if you remember, the G20 was a bit of a letdown. Even the call to increase the IMF's special drawing rights actually was blocked at the end. So really, one is talking about a response that's just grossly incommensurate with the need of the hour. Now, which leads you, the second question, therefore, whom should we call? I guess a kind of semi-facetious answer, which is not semi-facetious, is, if she exists, I mean, God. But, hopefully it's a feminine God without the toxic masculinity that we're seeing all around. But the truth is, really, there is no one to call at this stage. To be fair, I think, at least some, maybe the head of one or two institutions are taking the lead and are not being supported by their membership and by the leading countries. But, in some sense, this is it's only to be expected, given if you believe, what I've said, that we have a G-2 world, where the status quo power and the incumbent power, i.e., US and China, they are not just not providing global public goods, they're actually actively, proactively providing public bads. So in this situation, is it any surprise that, the response has been so weak?
So Arvind, I just want to follow up with you on this because, you served in government, you engaged with policymakers from the US, from China, from the EU, from all around the world, at the highest levels. But specifically when it comes to the U.S., how surprised are you at the lack of U.S. leadership when it comes to kind of rallying the troops, around the world, both in terms of kind of like-minded governments as well as, countries like China, which are rivals, but who you need to corral if you want an effective international response?
I think, Milan, that question requires kind of a two-part response, right? I mean, first, obviously, there is the obvious punching bag, which is the current administration, which is kind of eccentric and incontinent, to say the least, and therefore, it's very, very difficult to envision this leadership providing the kind of coordinating role that, say, President Obama provided in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. So there's obviously a kind of a leadership problem, but that's not my area of expertise. We all know what the problem is. But I think the kind of deeper question to ask is this, is twofold. One, how much of this is just a problem of erratic transitory leadership, and how much does it reflect really something more basic going on in the US, which is that, with this complete polarization within the United States, is this, domestic political dysfunction more structural or just transitory? So I think that's kind of an open question, and I think you could argue that both ways. The second, of course, bit to that is it's kind of easy to fault, the U.S. administration, but if you step back and think about it, as a status quo incumbent power, is there not, more bipartisan support in the United States that, China does represent an existential threat to U.S. hegemony, and therefore, is it again more structural rather than just associated with, the current leader or the current administration? So I think that I think is the more. So the implication of that is, come November, say things change in Washington, will kind of the U.S. response to dealing with China, to dealing with international cooperation, or to dealing with issues like immigration, will that be kind of vastly different from what it is today? It's kind of an open question.
So I want to come back to the issue of China, but let's talk first about India. Give us a scale of the economic impacts that COVID-19 is having on India. The IMF projects that India's GDP will grow at about 1.9% in the coming fiscal year. That's 2020, 2021. But at the Indian Express's virtual Adda just the other day, you called the IMF projections both bizarre and absolutely mystifying. And, those are pretty strong words, Arvind. So, what, to your mind, is a more realistic projection for India's growth?
Yeah. So just, first, let's just discuss why, I kind of use those words. If you look at the IMF's forecast for advanced countries, let's say, right, broadly it's projecting a 8.5 percentage point decline for the advanced economies, right? Going from 2% to -6, -7, in that ballpark. That's a 8.5 percentage point decline. Now, if you look at India, remember, heading into the crisis, the economy was weakening very, very significantly. So the pandemic was not the first shock; was a shock coming upon long-standing decline and weakening of the economy, including a very fragile financial sector. So that's point one. Point two. The response of the Indian government, the policy response, the lockdown, has not been very different from most advanced countries. In fact, many people have commented about how dramatic and severe the Indian lockdown has been. So in terms of the policy response and therefore the economic impact, it's not very different from advanced economies. Third, if you compare the fiscal response of advanced economies in India, the advanced economies are at the moment something like their response amounts to 8.5% of GDP, and India's is less than 1%. So a shock that's hitting a weaker and weakening economy, the policy response has been similar, and the ability to respond via fiscal is much worse. So how could you possibly say that for the advanced economies, it will decline by 8.5%, and for India, it will only decline by 2 percentage points? It absolutely makes no sense. Even if you allow for the fact that the Indian economy has a higher potential rate of growth, which I think I would dispute because of the pre-existing vulnerabilities. So it absolutely makes no sense to say that the Indian economy will be vastly more cushioned than advanced economies, despite all these things pointing the other way. So I would say that I'm not going to make a projection because, as you know, talking about GDP numbers always gets me into trouble. All I will say is that prudent, sensible economic policy planning in India should not rule out the possibility of definitely negative, possibly even substantially negative growth rates this coming year. And that's why in the Indian Express Adda, I used in Hindu mythology, the equivalent of the biblical flood is called pralaya. It's the deluge. And I think that's what it is. And already, Milan, not to belabor this, if you look already at the economic hardship that we've seen in India, if the unemployment and employment numbers are even remotely true that have been put out, if you see what's happened to the migrant workers, if you've seen what's happened to the stresses in the financial system, the impact has already been visible and absolutely severe, and nothing we've seen in Indian economic history.
So if the crisis is so severe, the question is, what should India do in response? And to date, the Modi government's economic package has been criticized for being too meager. It amounts to about 1% of GDP. You have called for India to spend much, much more, an extra 5% of GDP on stimulating the economy in the wake of the crisis. And so obviously the first questions that's going to come to many people's mind is this: how is India going to pay for this kind of package? And, you have just published a 3-part series with our mutual friend, Devesh Kapoor, in the Business Standard. We'll link to that on our show page. In those pieces, you outline several ways in which India could finance this additional expenditure. Tell us a little bit about what of some of the most important ideas are on the financing side.
Yeah, I think, Devesh Kapoor and I, kind of said, possibly the additional expenditure should be about 5% of GDP. This is just a rough kind of illustrative number. I think it could be a bit more, a bit less. But if you add in the cost of the health responses, you add in the kind of social insurance that you need to provide, and if you add in also the fact that the states need to be provided with a lot of money, I think you're looking at something like that, and of course also to support the commercial side, the corporate side, the small and medium enterprises. Now, how will it be financed? I think that we said that India is maybe it doesn't have the fiscal space that many advanced countries do, but in India, amongst developing countries, is kind of has more fiscal space, and that's why we said you should do not any one thing, but do a variety of things. So we said India needs to raise first, first cutting down, some kinds of expenditures, which, governments have already done, like a freeze on wage increases going forward. That's not insignificant. So cutting expenditures, raising money from abroad, including from non-resident Indians, then issuing bonds to the public, and some monetary financing. And in the end, we say maybe also some kind of solidarity taxes on the part of the wealthy. So it's kind of a five-pronged or five avenues for financing, and we give numbers on each of these. So I think there are three issues that are, I think, now important. One, can we take the fiscal hit? What is the logic of the monetary financing? And three, how should this be allocated between the center and the states? Remembering that the states are in the front line of the response, so they need a lot of money and they need it quickly. So there are, three parts. If we could go through that, Milan, one at a time, right? First, the extra debt that will have to be issued, will it make India, will it elicit, downgrades in ratings and kind of make India much more vulnerable going forward? And it's true that, if you look at many former central bankers have warned against excessive profligacy, saying that, we don't have the fiscal space. But my response to that is in two or three parts. See, first of all, I think that when we talk about the fiscal response, we should always keep in mind the counterfactual of what if you don't respond. If you don't respond, not only do you get all the hardship and things, you could have a level of economic activity that's so much more depressed that your debt to GDP ratios, in fact, look even worse without the action. So that's point one. Point number two is that, look, in these things, we always say the problem is what happens afterwards, right? And my point here is that the way markets should assess what India's, kind of outlook is going forward should be based on, what India also does, when the dust settles. If, for example, you have to spend all this money, but afterwards you have a fairly reasonable, prudent plan of getting back onto some sustainable fiscal path. And to be fair, this government had a record of, not being too profligate and not being, being very cautious about inflation. So you can, this government is credible if it says going forward, we will be responsible. Finally, I think the most important point is this, that, we save in order to spend for a rainy day. Now, this is not just a rainy day. This is a deluge. And, if you're not going to spend, if not now, what's the point of, being prudent in the past or being prudent going forward when the time comes, you're not able to respond? The last thing I would say about, these credit rating agencies and so on, remember that, doubts about, government's attitude to, prudence and responsibility also depends upon, what got you into the mess in the first place. This is a purely exogenous shock, which had nothing to do with any fault of this government or any other. So, so you can't say that, the response has to some extent is reflecting, changed behavior, irresponsible behavior, because there's going to be red ink all over the world. All governments are going to be doing this. So why should India be singled out? So that's on the fiscal side. The monetary side, Milan, is that, there are lots of concerns. India is not like advanced countries. It has higher inflation. There's also a current overhang of liquidity. But on balance, again, I do think that we can, some amount can be financed monetarily. It should be one-off. It should, the magnitude should not be too much. And, my sense is that this shock is going to be, demand deflationary for a very long time. So the fear that suddenly either this will lead to a lot of inflation or that it's going to lead to, a permanently irresponsible behavior in the future, I think those concerns are unwarranted. Last point about the center and the states. I think the states need a lot of money. Their revenues have been collapsing because of weak growth. They're doing a lot of spending. And I think, and also that the money that was due to them under the GST has been falling short. So I think we need to get them money quickly. And I have, two suggestions. One would be that the monetary financing is the quickest way to pump money. So maybe when we do the monetary financing, it should be to the states in the first instance. And also, I think, the Finance Commission transfers that were presented recently, maybe they need to be revisited to provide much more money to the states.
So I want to talk about the center and state issue, but not so much through the prism of financing, but through the prism of coordination. One of the things that you and Devesh speak about in your second piece is that there must be either a new institution created or perhaps even an old institution resuscitated, something like the Interstate Council, to coordinate between the center and the states. Describe for us why you think that's important and what purpose do you think such a body would serve in the current moment?
See, I think that, the need for coordination is absolutely clear in the pandemic. So many things, whether it's, where do the resources come from? Or whether it's, how do you treat the migrants? Whether it's, coordinated movements across states, or whether it's having, common testing standards, the availability of protective equipment, possible vaccines. So all of these will have to be done center and states together. So I think the need for coordination, I think, is not, it doesn't need to be established. I think what is more, important is, what should be the format for this coordination, both now and what lessons do we learn from this going forward. Now, the first thing I would say is that remember that in the recent past, we had one great example of center-state coordination, what we call cooperative federalism, which is the passage of the goods and services tax. Leave aside whatever the difficulties and glitches of implementation have been for the GST. The point is this was an example of both all the states and the center giving up their fiscal sovereignty to some extent to pool that to create this one market, one tax, etc. So that's, I think, a really sterling example of cooperation and coordination. Now, in this crisis, I think we have seen, the Prime Minister has been holding meetings frequently with the states. It's proceeding somewhat well. Maybe in some cases, I think the states feel a little bit shortchanged because they're not getting the resources quickly enough. But I think the key point is that it's not so much what structures you create as, how you use them. And in all these things, Milan, as you know, institutions get built in the following way. You get into the habit of, talking and talking and talking. It produces good results. That in turn gets institutionalized. People see the benefit of that. And that's how you kind of make some of these structures more permanent because people see value in them. So I am less kind of interested or concerned about, whether it should be the Interstate Council or Niti Aayog or whatever, but just the fact that we get into the habit of coordinating and talking all the time and then making those structures permanent because everyone sees value in them. Why it's important is because, today it's the pandemic. Mr. Arun Jaitley and I always used to say that, if you take whether it's agriculture or power, these are all subjects which need a lot of reform, but where the levers are both controlled by the center and the states. So you can't, in India, I think to say, oh, let's decentralize is not, I think, a good recipe at all, because all these things, both center and states control the levers. So if you want reforms going forward, it has to be done together. Some amount of competition, but a lot of coordination as well.
So one of the things that institutions would be important to do, presumably, is kind of fashion what you call a new social contract. You touch upon this in the third part of your series with Devesh, and that social contract would help bind society together in the wake of this awful pandemic. And when you kind of spell out some of the elements of this social contract, there are things like a new tax on billionaires' wealth, freezing wages for public employees, new property taxes, a universal basic income. Many of these things sound, positively Thomas Piketty-esque. How have your views on what economic policies the state must adopt evolved as this crisis has evolved, as we've learned new facts?
Right. I think many of these ideas predate Piketty, but I think I've been reading his book recently and very impressed with the book. So maybe there is a residual Piketty kind of influence here. But not really. If you think about it, if you remember, Milan, the whole idea of the universal basic income is something that we raised, about 4 years ago in the economic survey that we wrote. So that idea was always there, and there, the open question always was, how do you finance it? Right? That was, do we have the fiscal space to finance something like a universal, or what I call a quasi-universal basic income? Now, as we were writing about this, Devesh had this, I think, really important insight that in order to respond to the current crisis, those two sections of society that have been relatively protected from this, i.e. the wealthy and those with secure jobs, the salaried class, as it were. They were few and they were cushioned against the shock, and the vast majority, 70-80% have actually suffered from the COVID shock. So it was like, for this current crisis, why shouldn't there be some expression of solidarity in the form of, tax contributions by the wealthy and by the salaried class to fight this crisis? Then what we said was, okay, but this is an idea that I think should have more permanent expression going beyond the crisis to a more permanent social compact. And so that's where, so this is where I think, at least my thinking has evolved in line with the solidarity argument, which is that I was always keen on a universal basic income, but this idea of solidarity then, raised the idea in our head that maybe we can have, more permanent taxes on the wealthy and on property as dedicated resources to fund a universal basic income. Remember, in public finance, we don't like earmarking specific resources for specific uses. But FDR's great insight in doing the New Deal was to say, forget about this purism of public finance. Actually, if you get dedicated taxes for dedicated uses, it's politically more saleable. And that's how kind of Social Security began. So that was the inspiration for us to say, look, maybe we can do something similar as the new social compact, taxes on wealth, taxes on property, dedicated to finance this universal basic income. And remember, even property taxes and wealth taxes, at least for me, were not because, the whole, what I call the French musketeers, Piketty, Assayas, and Zuckman, talking about this. Because when I was in government towards the end, some of us were on a tax committee. And you look at India, you look at India and you see property taxes are property is highly undertaxed. Now think about this, Milan. A developing country in the most dynamic phase of its growth, property values soaring, immobile factor, it's just the juiciest tax handle with the least efficiency costs, and we've completely underexploited this. So it would be almost fiscal irresponsibility if we did not do something about this. So it's something we needed to do in any case, and the same thing for wealth taxes. So the challenge really is what you need to do, what you should have done in any case. Can we think about it, do a better job of actually taxing it in order to create this new social compact? The issues are not easy because property in India can be taxed at multiple levels. Wealth taxes were there in the past and they were kind of didn't yield very much revenue. So we do need to think about how to do it technically. But the fact of the expression of solidarity, making that permanent and financing a universal basic income is actually, I think, for me, a very attractive, and for Devesh and me, a very attractive idea.
I mean, you rightly pointed out that this issue of a UBI is something that you have been discussing quite publicly, at least for 4 or 5 years now. It's an issue that you first highlighted in the economic survey when you were the CEA. But the idea of a UBI in the Indian context rests in part on the success of what you termed the so-called JAM Trinity. Most of our listeners will know what JAM stands for. It's the trio of Jan Dhan Yojana, or universal bank accounts, Aadhaar, biometric authentication, and mobile money. But critics continue to point out persistent problems with this JAM infrastructure, which makes both errors of inclusion and exclusion not just possible, but highly likely. And I'm wondering, at this point, can we acknowledge that these critics do have a valid point here?
Yeah, I think, again, it's a question of, really the half empty, half full thing, right? I think this government deserves a lot of credit for actually, building, starting and initiating this JAM plumbing or infrastructure. First of all, by creating these, accounts for all Indian citizens. So I think the progress has been huge, and we have something to work with. But I do think the critics have a point because we've had there are a lot of last mile challenges. It is not the case that everyone can access these accounts for reasons of geography, for reasons of still financial non-inclusion. You may not have ATMs, you may not have banking correspondence, you may have to walk, 3 miles to a bank. So I think those problems do exist. But I think that this is a problem that actually can be cracked through more concerted action by both central and state governments. So this is a solvable problem. At the moment, yes, there are both errors of inclusion and exclusion. But as an aside, I think in the current crisis, I still think we should, pump money into this and not worry about, as long as a lot of deserving people, get the social insurance, at this stage, we should not worry about whether some undeserving got it or not. We should just think. But yes, in the long run, we need to complete the JAM plumbing so that something like a universal basic income can become a practical reality as opposed to just a kind of ideal that we should be aspiring to.
So, before we end, Arvind, I want to bring this conversation back to China if we could, because many people have pointed out that the global backlash against China presents kind of a unique opportunity for India, perhaps to finally make its way into major global supply chains as multinationals look to relocate from China elsewhere. Many people who know you from your work on India may not know that you've long been a scholar and an observer, an expert on the Chinese economy as well. And so I'm wondering, is there a genuine opportunity for India here? And if so, if you agree with that, what would it have to do to really exploit it?
See, Milan, it's a very good question, except that I think we have to be a little bit careful here. You see, the much bigger long-term structural opportunity was created by, maybe 5, 7, 8 years ago as China was graduating out of being a low-cost producer and exporter of low-skill intensive goods like clothing, footwear, etc. So that opportunity has been there for about 5-7 years. We economists use the term, China, the Lewis curve turned for China some while ago. And so, but that opportunity has been there for a long time, the real long-term structural opportunity. But the truth is that none of that relocated away from China and came to India in any significant quantity, despite, the Prime Minister's Make in India program. To whatever extent the relocation happened, we know that it went to places like Vietnam and Bangladesh, who've become the next generation exporting superstars. So that long-term opportunity we didn't exploit. Yes, it's true that now, you've added to that opportunity one more level, but the bigger opportunity was earlier. So what Devesh and I said was something along the following lines. Let's not get over excited by this new opportunity because we didn't exploit the old opportunity, but can we be a little bit more specific and concrete this time around? I think the world is going to reevaluate its reliance on China, its import, especially for things like pharmaceuticals. The whole, the active pharmaceutical ingredient for antibiotics, for example, China is one of the, dominant producers and exporters in the world. India, once upon a time, used to be an efficient producer of these APIs. And, as you know, India has a very competitive generic pharmaceutical industry. So can we, this time around, not talk about Make in India more broadly as kind of this generic thing, but just say focus on one sector? The crisis has created the opportunity for the pharmaceutical sector, let's say. Can we kind of, devote all government energy, government and industry get together and say, let's do the Make in India, but this time on pharmaceuticals. And if that's successful, maybe we can replicate that for other sectors. So that's the way I would approach it this time around, not to get overexcited because we haven't exploited in the past, but, maybe start narrow and specific, exploiting the specific opportunity created by this crisis, namely pharmaceuticals.
So Arvind, let me sort of wrap up this conversation on a bit of a wonky or nerdy note. I would just note that there are legions, scores of social scientists, economists, political scientists who are out there who see this pandemic staring India dead in the face and would like to do their part to, carry out research that they feel is both timely and relevant, responsive to policymakers. And again, putting on your former CEA hat as somebody who was a top-ranking government advisor who consumed research that was being done on the outside in academia from the think tanks, are there 2 or 3 areas where you think social scientists could meaningfully contribute? If you could sort of have your wish list, what are some of those burning areas or questions you think should be top of mind?
Milan, great question, because I do think that's a very, very important question. So let me throw out 2 or 3 ideas that I think will be really important going forward. First, India's big failing over the last 75 years has been, human capital, primary education, primary health. We've not done very well. Now, this crisis has shown that Kerala, this is a model worthy of emulation, right? So how can we create Keralas elsewhere in India? And it's as much a political economy, politics question as it is kind of just implementation and resources question, which is that, I would like to know that after the crisis, other Indian states, they look at Kerala. Does the political economy of, building state capacity, investing in primary healthcare, does that become more politically attractive or not? And what would it take to make it more politically attractive? Because remember, I think it's not enough to say, oh, the state has failed. I mean, to some extent, the state has failed because the political parties have not seen opportunity and they've not been penalized or rewarded, for doing or not doing healthcare and education. Does this, the Kerala example, if Kerala comes out as a star and a shining success, is that an opportunity, a political opportunity? And what is the evidence on that across India? I mean, that I really a first order question. I think the second thing, Milan, is that one of the things Devesh and I wrote about, is that we've suddenly woken up to the fact that, wow, we have so many migrants in India, urban migrants, and it's not clear that at all that we treat them as kind of equal citizens. So, just understanding how these migrants, where do they live? What are the amenities they get? What kinds of social insurance do they get or not get? And, what inputs do we need to kind of change that? So that, because remember, going forward, the last thing we want is for India to have less migration, because migration is really a source of dynamism for India, for upliftment, dynamism, and everything. If we are to retain this, we may have to rejig our institutional structures, our social safety nets, coordination between governments. But what do we need to do that is something we need to have much more information and data on. And the last thing I think is just to follow up on what you said. This is perhaps a little bit more just understanding, and we need more data because it's finally an implementation issue, to really understand what are these last mile bottlenecks in finishing the JAM plumbing, the JAM architecture. I'd certainly like to know more about what are the actual implementation hurdles. How does it vary across terrains, across governments, and how can we complete them? Anything research that sheds light on that would be valuable for completing the JAM infrastructure and creating the basis for what Devesh and I called the new social compact going forward.
My guest on the show today is Arvind Subramanian. He served as the chief economic advisor to the government of India between 2014 and 2018. He's currently a professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. He has been absolutely prolific in terms of writing about the virus, the global need for coordination, the role of China, what's happening in India. Arvind, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks a lot for having me, Milan.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Megan Maxwell and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Lauren Dueck is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.